Dear listeners, welcome again to the English service of Radio Television ISHAKWE, the voice of a Rwandan opposition party in exile. We are broadcasting from Washington, D.C. every Monday at 3 p.m. Today's guest is Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Sixbert. Glad that I'm here.
Yeah, thanks to be here. Today we're going to talk about France and the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis in 1994. It's a very interesting topic because the role of France during the genocide, it has been changing with leaders. Every president has his own version of the role of France. And the latest with the President Macron is that France could have stopped the genocide, but it lacked the will to do so. Cooperation between France and Rwanda has increased after the military putsch in 1973, when President General Habyarimana took power from President Gregoire Kayibanda. The role of France has increased that time with the creation as well of the Gendarmerie Nationale that replaced the national police that was there during Kayibanda era. France introduced, actually it was like a copy of the system in France with the army and the gendarmerie and then the police. But during the time of Habyarimana, the gendarmerie was assuming the role of the police as well. So that cooperation increased that much in a way. For example, 4 years after Habyarimana took power, that was the Franco-African Summit that took place in Rwanda in May 1979. France constructed the Urugwiro village, that's the presidential palace now, where offices of Kagame are for now. That cooperation got another boost when RPF invaded in October 1990. In this program, we are going to talk about how RPF considered the role of France during that time and what has been the role of France during the Arusha peace talks, after the peace agreement, and after the presidential plane was downed on the 6th of April 1994, and the role of France after RPF took power. Let's start immediately with the first question. Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, that time during the RPF war against the then government in Rwanda, you've been in charge of diplomacy and then Secretary General for RPF. How did your organization that time, how did it consider France? What was, in your eyes, what was France doing in Rwanda? Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA.
Well, thank you very much, Sixbert, for giving me an opportunity to share my views and of course your views too, because you lived in Rwanda at that time. I didn't. I had grown up in exile. I grew up in exile in Uganda, but I also lived as a refugee in Burundi, in Tanzania, and Kenya as well. But it's in Uganda where I grew up. But maybe for listeners who may not be very well acquainted with the story of Rwanda's relationship with outsiders, in very few words, I would say, just to remind them that Rwanda, at the time of colonial conquest of Africa, Rwanda was first colonized by the Germans. before the First World War at the end of the 19th century. And then when the Germans lost the war during the First World War, it came under the ownership. I say ownership because that's what colonialism is. But it came under the so-called protection, which cannot be protection, but came under the ownership of Belgium, who ruled it until independence in 1962, right?
Yeah, I think it was the UN. At that
The
time,
League
I
of
think it was the
Nations.
SDN. It was
Yes.
a trustship, and then
Yes, trustship.
and then it was a trustship, and Belgium was actually the representative of the UN, theoretically.
Theoretically, but in
Mm.
essence, it was
It was
offered.
yeah, it
It
was
was
offered. Yeah, it was offered, and it was a property of. It's like a property of Belgium.
yes, alongside Burundi, and in fact, during the ownership of the Germans, it used to be part of what was called German Ost Africa,
Yeah.
together with Tanzania. So they were part of the ownership of Germans alongside Tanganyika during the First World War, and after they lost, it became a trustee territory under the ownership of Belgium. And so it was quite interesting what you mentioned, that after the military coup of 1973,
73.
that France started having a more pronounced role than Belgium, which for quite several decades had been the main foreign power that was influencing the course of events in Rwanda, especially at the time of the end of the monarchy, the establishment of an independent Rwanda. Really, Belgium was very much involved in the process of regime change, from the monarchy to independence, to being a republic, from Rwanda being ruled by a small group of Tutsi kings and chiefs, to becoming essentially a Hutu republic, a republic under the governance of a
Mm.
Hutu elite.
Yes, but Belgium
Yes.
has even fired and exiled the king Musinga in I think 1930.
Yes.
Yeah,
So it
regime.
was not
Mm.
it
Yeah, it
was
was.
not the first time they were getting involved in regime change.
Yeah, it wasn't the first time in Rwanda. Yes.
Yes. And so in terms of what we in the RPF were thinking about about the French, everyone amongst us before the invasion of 1990, in a way, our prediction was quite correct, because we used to say that as soon as there is a contest between the regime of the Habyarimana's regime with others, and in this case, others we thought would be the ones to fight the regime in a military way. At least that's what we always thought. We always believed that France will come to the rescue of the regime. And we always believed that Belgium would come to the rescue of the regime. And we always believed that Zaire, that's what the Democratic Republic of Congo was called then, under President Mobutu Sese Seko,
Yes. Mm.
we always say Zaire would come to the rescue of Habyarimana. And indeed, as you remember, Sixbert,
Yeah, they
with the
all did
open,
that time. Yes.
they all
Mm.
did. So our predictions were very true. And subsequently, of course, the Zairean troops withdrew ultimately, and Belgian troops withdrew. But the French troops, according to the French colonial policy, because remember, the French colonial policy was not only exercised in Rwanda, it was in a swath of territories in Central Africa, in West Africa. It was even particularly strong in West Africa, where they have even, how do they call it, their currency, the CFA. And they maintained a military presence in a number of African countries that were former French colonies. So we were right that the French would come to the rescue of the regime of Habyarimana. In fact, if we fast forward, even the plane that carried the president of Rwanda traveled in,
Yeah,
even
it
on
was
that
given by
fateful
France.
day,
Mm.
was given by France. But besides all that, there was a special relationship between the then president of France, Francois Mitterrand, and President Habyarimana, as everybody knew. So that's how we looked at it. France was very, very close to the regime of that time.
Actually, what you say is true because I was in Rwanda and the presence of France, it became more and more visible with the Habyarimana regime. And then with the invasion, the RPF invasion, they took part actively. Actually, they took part when RPF invaded, and they took part as well when RPF, there is a time there was a violation of ceasefire, and the RPF troops, they came up to a few kilometers from the capital, Kigali. And that time, I remember that French troops were deployed in those areas, and they said that they will engage the RPF troops if they continue towards the capital, Kigali. And then there was as well this the French map, like countries, former colonies of France, or the countries that were French speaking. When RPF invaded, it was like a threat to a French area. And France felt that responsibility to protect each area, because the invasion of RPF was seen as the invasion of English-speaking people. And then France took part actively. I was a journalist that time, and we used to discuss with French diplomats. It was their war. So they thought it was very important to be to support the regime in order to support French language. That's what they were telling us that time. I
Yes,
have
yes.
I have many questions to ask you about that, because France played a key role as well during the Arusha peace talks. The first time I saw you, it was in Arusha, and I know you've been very active there, and uh, you can explain to our listeners your role actually in Arusha during the peace talks. How did you see the role of France that time? How did you consider France during those talks? Or did France really influence, like, did it exert any kind of influence on the talks?
Well, as you might recall, the Russia peace talks started after very there was a lot of diplomatic activity in East Africa immediately after the invasion of October 1, 1990. There were all these summits of heads of state in Mwanza, in Arusha, in Tanzania, in Zaire, what was then called Zaire. And you might also recall that President Mobutu was supposed to be the mediator in the Arusha peace talks before they became Arusha peace talks. At that time, they were
Yeah,
just
before actually there were Nsele talks,
Nsele,
and
yes.
that time I think Mobutu was a mediator. He
He
was.
was the mediator, yes. The
Mm.
Nsele peace agreement, ceasefire agreement, which people can look at online, signed between Kagame and Bizimungu. Bizimungu was the foreign minister of Rwanda, and Kagame at that time was Major Kagame. and was the chairman of the High Command of RPF's army, Rwandese Patriotic Army, was signed under that umbrella of President Mobutu being the mediator. But we used to make fun of it, that how could President Mobutu, who was essentially an agent of the French and whose friendship with Habyarimana was known, and the friendship of Habyarimana and Mitterrand was known, and the support of the French was known amongst us, how could they broker what would be called a fair ceasefire agreement, or even a fair fair talks, fair conversations between the two? But at that time, when we signed the ceasefire agreement, the listeners may not be aware that RPF's army was really in big trouble, because remember, by the end of 1990, in December, essentially, Rwanda's troops had thrown us out of the territory of Rwanda, which looked like a defeat of the RPF and a victory for the Rwandan troops. And you remember there was a lot of celebration within that. I remember even the songs that used to be sung by a number of musicians and artists in Rwanda, saying how they knocked us out of action in a number of areas in Rwanda. I remember very well. And so at that time, by the end of 1990, we were quite vulnerable. And at the beginning of 1991, really RPF was in bad shape. We had essentially relocated from that axis of going through the Akagera, and we're now contemplating how we could reorganize essentially from the Virunga Mountains, from Habur, at least to try and replenish our forces. So it was during this period of time that the ceasefire agreement was signed. We needed it desperately because we needed to reorganize. And the government, which had until then resisted to be on the same table with RPF, because that's how governments behave. When they are challenged, they don't want to accept that there's a rebellion. They don't want to accept that the rebels can be at the same table as themselves. They are the legitimate representatives. The rebels are just rebels. You know the names they used to call us, bandits, and all sorts of things. So the ceasefire agreement was very much needed for us to begin that process of negotiation. And then, of course, the attack on Ruhengeri in early 1991 gave us like a bonus, because we not only demonstrated that we are still alive. For a rebel group to mount something like that is a bonus, because it demonstrates that you are not dead, that you are not defeated, because on our side, we still had a cause. And that's why people who are fighting for a good cause may suffer setbacks like we did at the end of 1990. Our supreme leader had been killed, General Fred Rwigema. The second and third in command, Dr. Peter Bayingana and Munyenyezi, had been killed. Kagame was very much new on the front. He had not yet established his authority over this army that was more or less like in disarray. We had so many people who were starving. And that's why I will come back to that much later in another program, because people who say, oh, these were Anglophones sent by Museveni and supported by Americans, the way we were at the end of 1990 is not a rebel army being supported by a superpower, because we were in big trouble. We're in very, very big trouble. So that's kind of the kind of conspiracy theories that some people who are defeated, they have to find out some ways or means of justifying why they were defeated, why the Habyarimana's regime was defeated. But we're in big trouble. So the French, from then on, as tactfully the mediation process, was given another name. We used to say Mobutu is facilitator, but Tanzania, no, Mobutu is the mediator, but Tanzania is the facilitator. That's how we would frame it. But essentially, it was one way of running away from the so-called mediation of President Mobutu, because we thought that Mobutu and France were one and the same. And they are one and the same as Habyarimana himself. And so increasingly, the role of France was in the background. I'm not privy to what the French would advise Habyarimana at that time, or what instructions Habyarimana would give to Kanyero Shoke, who was the main lead negotiator in the Arusha peace process. Our lead negotiators were Pastor Bizimungu and the late Patrick Mazimaka. And increasingly, many of us were associated with it in and out, but those were our two lead negotiators. And all these countries like US, like France, like Belgium, or Tanzania, of course, was a facilitator. The UN was present. The OAU was very much present. So France was playing a background role, but you could see that the government of Rwanda, especially Habyarimana and his group, had some kind of confidence that they have a very powerful ally in France. And so that in itself gave them some false confidence to negotiate as we try to look at all these issues, whether it's the issue of that initial protocol on governance. But once we got into the nitty-gritty of, what is going to be the shape of the national army when you integrate both the government forces and the RPF forces, what is going to be the structure of the national government, the parliament, and the shape of the cabinet when it came to power sharing. In short, these are elites sharing the power in the government, and also the question of refugees. And so France was playing a background role, but in the meantime, of course, continuing to advise the government army and continuing to support the government politically and diplomatically, especially the United Nations. So that's what I can say, that as the Arusha peace process or the Nsele process gathered a bit of pace and momentum, the role of France was being the political advisor, the diplomatic advisor, the military advisor to the regime of Habyarimana, and that gave the regime a bit of self-confidence.
That's true. And how have you seen the role of France then after the Arusha peace talks, after the agreement was signed by both parties? And a few months later, President Habyarimana was killed, was assassinated when his plane was downed. And France at that time tried to have a key role because I know France has evacuated dignitaries of the former regime from Kigali to Bujumbura. And I know that France has been even supplying arms during the war. How did you see the role of France? I mean, from the RPF view.
Yeah, April 6, 1994, we signed the Arusha Peace Agreement in August 1993. And between the signing of the Arusha Peace Agreement and April 6 of 1994, even before then, let me share with the listeners and the viewers a bit of an anecdote. You remember, Sixbert, that during when the Arusha peace negotiations started, there was a time when France, rather Rwanda, always said that it was Uganda, that we come from Uganda to attack Rwanda. And Uganda kept on saying, of course, that yes, we invaded from Uganda, but they do not support us, and they do not give us any logistical support, of course, which was untrue. You know, because they gave us a lot of things. That's why sometimes I'm shocked when I hear Kagame and Kabarebe and the company in public saying that, you know, we didn't receive much from Uganda. It was our own struggle. After all, we had also fought in the war, but that is nonsense. It was very clear. Our sick base, our sick people, our logistical lines were through Uganda. We got a lot of arms and ammunition from Uganda. Even those that we purchased from outside, especially towards the end, would always come through Uganda.
Definitely. It was through Uganda,
Our communications line, when we used to, in fact, let me say it, people may not know, our
radio
if
station.
for example, yeah, not the radio station later was in Mabura, but when I traveled, for example, like any other person traveled that time, that was the time of we didn't have cell phones. The most advanced technology at that time was the fax machine. So if I was at the United Nations or at the Organization of African Unity, or I was traveling and had to report back, I would send a fax to Kale Kaihura. Kale Kaihura, there was a time, for a long time, Kale Kaihura was the host to Kagame every time he came to Uganda, which was often in Kampala. He was in Kampala. And that's where the signaler, the military signaler for RPF was also located. So I would have to send a fax machine a fax message to Kale Kaihura's place. This military signaler would have to get it and convert it into a military message to Kagame, who would be in Mulindi. So the fax message was our main, and that was in Kampala. So I cannot even begin to, that maybe would be another program for me to elaborate on it, because it simply irritates me to hear. It irritates me to hear Kagame and Kabarebe and others saying, you know, especially maybe now, right now, it's kind of calm, but at the time of heightened attention, the military officers in Rwanda and Kagame himself are always trying to minimize the role of Uganda. So anyway, that was not what I wanted to say. I wanted to say that because of that, Rwanda was working with France at the United Nations to try and get an interposition force between Uganda and Rwanda. Sixbert, do you remember it? That was
yes,
the
I do.
initial.
I do remember. I do remember that they tried to have some kind of, not a buffer zone, but some kind of
monitoring.
A military presence there.
Yes, to
along
monitor.
the border. Yes,
Yes,
yeah.
I later on
Actually,
learned
it was a
that
monitoring team.
it was a
along the
monitoring
common
team.
border. Yeah.
So the story I wanted to tell, which is quite interesting. So we didn't know that initiative until late, but Claude Osidi, the late Claude Osidi, my friend and brother, were in New York. And in New York, we heard that actually they are trying to debate. They normally send a forward team to go and assess the situation. Then the UN, that team comes back and makes a recommendation. So one of our colleagues at the United Nations, I won't mention his name, just protect the country that was friendly to us, simply told us that, do you know that tomorrow that we shall be debating at the United Nations, this whole business of having a monitoring team at the border between Rwanda and Uganda. And that I remember the head of that team was a general, a French general, General Barrier. I remember the last name. And I pleaded with this guy. I said, can you give us really an advance copy of what this report is talking about? And he was very kind to me. He actually gave me that report. I read through it. I could see that the French and the Rwandese were actually trying to find a way of monitoring that border so as to obstruct, and they were putting pressure on Uganda, of course. They were putting pressure on Uganda to accept it. And so overnight, once I got it, I remember I used to travel with a small computer, which I didn't even know how to use. But I tried. I tried to use this small computer in a hotel room. And then I wrote a very fiery rebuttal against that. And overnight, I sent it to all the members of the Security Council. And subsequent to that, of course, I was made person non grata at the United Nations. I could not, after that, visit the United Nations without them giving me a security to accompany me, because it's like there was a reputation that I'm fond of stealing documents. That's the reputation I had at the United Nations. But I then approached the Ugandan ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Kamnanu, and I said, really, are you going to support this resolution to establish this kind of force? And he said, look, Theogene, there isn't much we can do, because if we do not accept it, they will say that we're accomplices in whatever you are doing and whatever is taking place in Rwanda. So that gave me the impression the French were very much sponsoring that, and they got it. And they got it because they wanted to obstruct RPF. So after the April 6, the viewers who watched our last program, we talked about how the United States took a leading role in convincing the rest of the world to abandon the Tutsi, to abandon Rwandans, or the Hutus that were also being killed. Essentially, the international community abandoned Rwanda because of the role of the United States under the leadership of Clinton at that time. But they were able to abandon Rwanda at that time simply because they're also trying to appease France. So it was like an unholy handshake between France and the United States, essentially to say, okay, let's just leave this country to its owners. On the one hand, in Interahamwe and the regime of the day were busy killing Tutsis. RPF on its side was pressing ahead in order to capture state power, and in the meantime, it too was killing as many Hutu as they could, and we shall come to that in another program. So essentially, France and the United States made a devil's pact to abandon Rwanda at its hour of need, leaving the Tutsis to their persecutors, to their killers, and leaving Hutus to their persecutors and killers. And I do not know whether you want me to go straight to Operation Turquoise, because I want to give another anecdote as a kind of background to see how France was very much engaged with the regime of the day, and how France was not caring for the deaths of Tutsis and not caring for the deaths of ordinary Hutus as well, and how that led to...
Did you take part in any kind of bilateral negotiations with France, with French leaders?
Yes, be saying something and I take a little water. You can be saying something about how did you hear about Operation Turquoise?
Actually, I heard about it before it started, because Gerard Prunier, the writer, and I know that that time he has been in touch with the RPF as well. So he has been, I can say that he was one of my friends. Because he has been visiting Rwanda before, we knew each other. And then when they were preparing this operation Turquoise, we met in Byumba. I was in Byumba in the RPF controlled area. We met there, and briefly he told me that they were preparing an operation that could stabilize the country. I understood something like that.
Mm. Well, the Operation Turquoise is quite interesting. So April 6, that's when the plane that was carrying President Habyarimana and the President of Burundi, Cyprien Ntaryamira, was shot down under the command of Kagame, who was the leader of the Rwandese Patriotic Army. And when that happened, of course, that triggered the whole sequence of events, which in the past we talked about. So at some point, France was really trying to advise the region. I mean, Tanzania, who was the facilitator, and putting pressure on Uganda as well, putting pressure on President Museveni, the president of Tanzania, the late President Mwinyi of Tanzania as facilitator, and the rest. They are putting a lot of pressure on us, on RPF, still to make a deal with the provisional government, which of course we couldn't accept. Last time, I think I must have given an anecdote how I went to Arusha twice. The first time alone, myself, representing RPF. We had declared the unilateral ceasefire instead of making a handshake with the provisional government, which we had said we would never do, because they were busy killing Tutsis and killing Hutu. And you remember I mentioned how over a period of 1 week, I used to come from Murindi, and then President Museveni of Uganda would host a meeting between me and the rest of the excellencies, the ambassadors of the Western ambassadors. So when we declared a ceasefire and went to Arusha, clearly France, just as France and the United States had made a handshake, which I call the devil's handshake at the United Nations, to withdraw the troops, they were also behind the scenes being the ones to put pressure on RPF to make a deal with the provisional government of Kambanda and Sindikubwava and all these other people. And so, and of course, we resisted that. And then when they came to this whole thing of UNAMIR 2, again, France and the United States were behind the scenes putting pressure on RPF to accept that. But by then, RPF was of a single mind. We didn't want anything we could see that Habyarimana's army, although he was no longer living, but the government army was in disarray, as Kagame had predicted, and as he told me later, that when you decapitate a dictatorship, the house cannot stand. I hope that these days he also reflects on that. That was his dictatorship is decapitated, that will not be able to stand.
Apparently he's preparing for that, because apparently he's grooming his son and his daughter to take over.
Yes, but also
yeah,
but just as the provisional government didn't save the regime, I don't think that these dear sons and daughters of Kagame will be able to hold the fort. But that's besides the point. We shall discuss it later. So they were trying to, behind the scenes, to put pressure on us to deal with the provisional government, because in the mindset, if you put yourself in the mindset of the French, just as they had come to to support Habyarimana to defend him against us, against our invasion. And just as they had maintained their presence in Rwanda as advisors, giving political support, giving diplomatic support, giving the military advice, and so on and so forth, even at that late hour, they are not willing to accept that actually the regime was in its last days. So they wanted to salvage whatever remained of the regime, and whatever remained of the regime at that point was the provisional government. And so, of course, RPF at that time was bent on capturing state power. The other things that we hear about Kagame and Kabarebe and all these people saying that they were in the business of trying to stop the killings of Tutsi, that is nonsense. That's beside the point. For Kagame and the company and all of us at that time, the prize was take power in Rwanda. The fact that the regime was defeated, its army was defeated, ended up stopping whatever bad stuff they were doing. But that was a secondary side effect. It was not the primary intention of the RPF. But let me then give the anecdote I wanted to give, because it came head on, even when at that point by June 1994, that I think UNAMIR 2 wasn't it like established in May? I don't remember the dates. You may help me with that. But the resolution,
I don't remember, but I think it's in May 1994.
It's in May.
Yeah.
But
May.
you can see how very, in a very cynical way, the French came up with this whole thing of saying, no, actually, for us, France, we would like to lead a peace enforcement operation. Remember, peacekeeping operations they are made two types. The one was like the Chapter 6, the one that came to Rwanda, 2,500, but they are there to keep the peace. The protagonists in the conflict have signed a peace agreement. They are not going to come to enforce it. They will simply oversee that whole process. But France wanted a Chapter 7 mandate at the United Nations.
United Nations, yes.
And they said that the main purpose of this Chapter 7 will now to come and save the Tutsis. That's where it becomes kind of very cynical, that the French, who had been on the side of Habyarimana, on the side of the provisional government, which was a strategic blunder. I think the French made a strategic blunder like the one they made in Indochina in the 50s, or the one they made in Algeria in the 1950s as well, in the War of Independence in Algeria. And all these mistakes they are making that are forcing many African countries to throw their armies, to throw their military out of their countries, which is another subject which I'll come to later. But how could now France be the defender of the Tutsis? This was very much on our mind. That fact that they might have saved maybe a few Tutsis, for me, I say, thank God, praise God that a few Tutsis were saved by the French. But the French coming to Rwanda, its main purpose was not to save the Tutsis. It was literally to figure out how to salvage whatever remained of the Hutu regime. And so RPF asked me, and they asked Bihozagara, remember during the RPF struggle, it was me, Bihozagara, the late Bihozagara, Dr. Jacques Bihozagara, and the late Patrick Mazimhaka, my colleagues, my departed colleagues, who were spearheading RPF's diplomacy. And so they sent me and Bihozagara to France. And one thing that as we arrived in Paris that I saw that had changed was that, we're the underdogs, but the way we were received in the past showed that our fortunes had multiplied. We're no longer the underdogs because we were received by a senior protocol officers from the French government. We are driven in a convoy from Charles de Gaulle Airport to a very wonderful 5-star hotel, which during the struggle, we never used to stay in the 5-star hotels. We stayed with people. If we stayed in hotels, if you remind me later, I'll tell you an anecdote on the kind of places where we stayed. So we went straight to meet Alain Juppé, who was at that time the foreign minister of France under François Mitterrand. We had a very interesting meeting, of course, and if you read Gerard Prunier's book, he actually captures the essence of that meeting. I was speaking in English, which of course made Mr. Juppé very jittery that I should be talking to him in English, but I didn't know any French. And Bihozagara would interpret for me because I was the lead, because I was Secretary General. So I naturally led Bihozagara. And he said that they are planning to launch Operation Turquoise. And essentially it is there to try and save, some Tutsis. And I told him, I gave him a bit of, I had talked to Kagame and that, briefed me on the issues I would raise with the foreign minister, Mr. Juppé. I told him that we have had a very difficult relationship and that for the French to intervene at this late moment is creating the impression that they are actually coming to support the provisional government, and that for us, you might interpret it as a hostile act, and that it will complicate the conflict in Rwanda. He tried to assure me, and he said after this meeting, you'll be going over to the État-Major to discuss with the generals to assure you that this is nothing about supporting the government or fighting you. And so at the end of the meeting, he escorted us outside his office at Quai d'Orsay, I think that's what they call it. And the footsteps, in front of the footsteps of the office, then he says, oh, by the way, the United Nations Security Council has passed a resolution that gives us a go-ahead to launch Operation Turquoise, and that we're trying to get as many people to be part of it. But so far, Senegal, I think he mentioned that Senegal had accepted to be part of the peacekeeping force under Chapter 7. And I remember being very troubled and being very taken aback and thinking on what is going to happen back in Rwanda, now in what is going to be battle lines drawn between us and the government of France and the government troops. So the next meeting we went to was at the État-Major. I met all these generals that were very prominent in the Operation Turquoise. And I remember, so they presented, what they are going to do, how they will land in Goma. And I would ask them, what kind of weapons do you have? They would say, oh, a couple of Jaguars and this and that. Then I would say, what is your concept of operations? When do you hope to begin this and when do you hope to end it? But I could see that it was improvised. They were not telling me much. Maybe they were hiding. But I could see they were hiding exactly what they would do. But of course, they didn't have the idea of the end point, because the concept of operation must have the starting point and the end game. And I would say, how are you going to save the Tutsis? Because remember, Sixbert, by then, the provisional government and their army were in those parts of southwest of Rwanda some of them in Changugu. And so
Yes.
you could see, yes, they
Actually,
do not give.
They were busy running away from Rwanda.
They
Yes.
are busy running away. So that is the leaving the meeting with Mr. Juppé and leaving the meeting with the generals at the État-Major. I left when I talked to Kagame. I had the impression that maybe we better prepare that RPA is going to fight the French troops. But of course, even with the French troops, it was too late in the game. If you have troops of the provisional government, of the government that are running away, there isn't much support and they have no reason to fight other than simply to remain and be involved in killing Tutsis and killing Hutus who didn't agree with them. Essentially, they had lost the war in their minds. A general can fight, even Napoleon, the French general, the renowned French general. Ultimately, there was an end to his military career because there was a time his military genius could not help him because it was time up. It was the same with the government army. Whatever France could have done with this provisional government and the ragtag troops that were freeing from our troops, there isn't much that they would have done to save the regime. Those are the two anecdotes that I wanted to share with the viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you took state power in July 1994. And how has been the cooperation or the relationship between France and the first RPF government?
Oh, Sixbert, I would suggest that maybe that becomes another program of ours, because in subsequent programs we want to talk about how not only the world and how not only United States or even France abandoned Tutsi, but they also abandoned Hutu during that period, but especially after RPF took power, because that's when the RPA killing of Hutus intensified, not only in Rwanda, but also in Congo, in DRC. And I would like to treat that reckless abandonment of Rwanda, of Tutsis and Hutus, is more or less the same. And so how the regime of RPF after 94 has dealt with France, and especially the issue of the investigation as to who shot the plane comes into picture. I would like to treat that during that period, but for now, I just wanted to show that France has always been on the side of the Habyarimana regime, has supported the Habyarimana regime diplomatically, politically, and militarily, that they were able to, even in the last days of the regime after the shooting down of the plane, they tried to coerce us, RPF, to talk to the provisional government to salvage the regime, to give it some kind of legitimacy, and also to point out that Operation Turquoise was the last gamble, strategic gamble, to try and see what could be salvaged of the regime that they supported for too long. And of course, it failed simply because the regime itself had no cause to exist. And so the French and the Americans, whatever reason they had to abandon Tutsis, they had similar reasons to abandon Hutu since then, up to the time we are speaking today. But we shall take up that subject in another program.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can head to the end of the program today and continue next time. But before that, I would like to ask you, you've been following the position of different leaders of France. I'm talking about François Mitterrand. I'm talking about Jacques Chirac, Nicolas Sarkozy, and Hollande didn't really say much about.
He didn't care.
Yeah, he didn't say much about Rwanda, but then Macron. Their positions have been changing all the time. It looks like either they have things to protect or to hide, but what is sure is that their position has been changing all the time, depending on the leader in place. Why is that?
I wish you could ask that question to Macron, to Sarkozy, to Hollande, to Jacques Chirac, or Mitterrand, but Mitterrand
Yeah,
is no longer
yeah.
he's no longer on this planet. But it's the same question. You see, you cannot look at the policies of the big powers, United States, France, Britain, the United Kingdom, even Russia and China in isolation. But when you look at the imperial powers, the question you might wish to ask, especially with respect to Rwanda, you'd ask the same question: what business did Germany have in Rwanda at the beginning of the 20th century? What business did Belgium have in Rwanda after that? And what business did France, and now lately, since we came to power, RPF in 1994, what business does United States and United Kingdom have in Rwanda? Because when you ask that broader question, discussing the specifics of how each president looks at the regime of the day, these regimes of ours in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. For them, Rwanda, if I limit myself to Rwanda is like a small chessboard. So it doesn't matter what Macron says, or what Sarkozy says, or what some other leader might say. There are certain institutions of France that look at Rwanda in a particular way. Sometimes a leader might come who might say, oh, like Macron has said, oh, France was capable of intervening, but he didn't. I mean, he's not stating something that is out of the way. Of course, everybody knows that if big powers had wanted, they would have probably saved Rwandans. But these regimes, these governments are not there. These big powers are not there to save anybody. They are there to promote their interests. At a certain point, they could see that Habyarimana was promoting the interests of France, either because Rwanda belonged to the sphere influence of French speakers, or simply because there was some other business they conduct with the regime. Just as today, somebody, we shall come to that in another program, to ask, what does America and the United Kingdom want in Rwanda? It doesn't matter, because if you look at it, Kagame's rule of Rwanda has gone through how many presidents in the United States? From Bush to Clinton, to Bush the son, to Obama,
yes,
to
Obama,
Trump, now to
yes.
Biden. But have you seen the policy of the United States towards Rwanda changing? No. They may have nuanced statements, sometimes like, what do they call it? A slap on the wrist.
Yes, yeah,
a slap on the wrist. But essentially, it's remember, the maxim in diplomacy is there are no permanent friends and there are no permanent enemies. In the relationships between countries, there are only permanent interests. In the case of Macron, who now these days is buddies with Kagame, it's not that he and the institutions that he leads in France have changed attitude towards Rwanda. No, he's appeasing Kagame and saying the things that Kagame wants to hear simply because of two things. Once again, Kagame and Macron have made a devil's pact, a devil's agreement. What did Macron give to Kagame? He said, from now onwards, France will not ask you about who shot down the plane, Habyarimana plane. And by the way, in that plane, there are also French citizens. The crew were from France. They also perished in the same accident. So Macron tells him, oh, from now, Kagame, I won't be asking France. The investigation will be no more. Just rest assured, this will be no more. And then Kagame promises that from onwards, Your Excellency, I will just put to your service my army, which will promote your business and economic interests wherever you want me. That's why Rwandan troops are in Mozambique, protecting Total interests, business interests. So, and before him, Macron, who knows Macron? Macron is Macron. I think his reputation in his own country is known. He's somebody who pursues personal business interests. Maybe he left power before he could figure out how to do business with Kagame, but he was on that kind of path of saying a very kind of fake mea culpa. You know, you go, you watch the genocide memorial in Rwanda. Macron does the same, and you feel sympathy and empathy, but these are fake because Macron, in another, if they have had now to support a dictatorial regime of Kagame, which makes it a double tragedy. That you supported the regime of Habyarimana, which is a dictatorship, and you never learned any lesson, and you're supporting another regime another time, which meant you didn't actually learn any lesson, just as you didn't learn any lessons from Indochina, or you didn't learn any lessons from Algeria, or these other places, which if you follow news, and I'm sure you do, you can see that France is in retreat because increasingly many countries are throwing its military out. But for now, if you remember, Kagame used to be enemies with the French. He used to be the rabid enemy of the French because as long as they kept on saying there is an investigation into who shot down the plane, there is no way. That is an existential question for Kagame. Anybody who will ever raise it will be an enemy of Kagame because to make him the culprit of the one who was responsible of making a decision that triggered the genocide, in which, of course, the Tutsis and the Hutus perished. For me, I don't see any difference between Macron and Mitterrand. I don't.
Could we consider the current relation between President Macron and President Kagame as a diplomatic victory from Kagame? Is it Kagame's diplomatic victory?
No, it's a diplomatic gamble. I won't call it. It's like the French in the last days of the Habyarimana regime. They gambled to support the regime at the beginning of the RPF invasion. It didn't work. RPF consolidated across the period until 1994. The government forces were losing ground, to the RPF forces. They gambled diplomatically and politically to try to work through the Americans and the regional leaders to make us make a deal with the provisional government. It didn't work. They tried to gamble with Operation Turquoise. It didn't work. So even now, a relationship that is related to just business interests, not the interests of Rwandans, or even the justifiable interests of the French people, the general population of the French people, that kind of gamble does not work. it gives you some breathing space to do business, maybe which might benefit Macron, might benefit Kagame, but in the long run, it's like a house built on sand. It cannot withstand any pressure. It will not withstand the winds. When the winds start blowing away that kind of chaff, it will collapse like a house of cards.
Yeah, that's very true. Any comment before we close this program, Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA?
No, well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me for this discussion, and we shall continue next week.
Yeah, thank you so much. Our program today was France and the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis. Our main guest was Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, and the presenter is Sixbert MUSANGAMFURA. Thank you so much for listening.